Hello again, comparative politics students. Another video for you. This time we're going to be talking about particular forms of political identity. So we had a video where we talked about institutions. Remember how we spoke about institutions as being separate from organizations. We spoke about them as being infused with value, taking on a life of their own, being an indispensable part of people's lives, not just in terms of politics, but also the very fabric of how we build society. And then within that, we spoke about the state as being a central political institution that organizes and maintains and defends political life and separates one country from another, right? So when we have states, we wind up having countries, but alongside of that, there's also the element of the political identity that people themselves have. Some of that is related to their connection to the state. Some of that exists separate from it. So we have this kind of cause and effect relationship about states giving rise to identities, identities giving rise to states. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about today is I wanted to talk about the idea of ethnic identity and the idea of national identity. I'm down here at the Puyallup tribe, again in Washington State, and I'm standing in front of a police car. Remember when we talked about the idea of the state, we talked about it being the monopoly of violence over a given territory, right? And so one of the things that's interesting to see here is that even though I'm in the city of Tacoma, I am inside the city boundaries and yet not inside the city boundaries, because right alongside the city itself is the Puyallup tribe. So I'm right here along Interstate 5, and here I see the police force of the Puyallup tribe itself. So ethnic identity, if we think about, for example, Native Americans in the United States, or we think about Kurds living in Iraq or Iran or in Turkey, we can talk about ethnic identity. And remember, what do we think about ethnic identity? It's ascriptive identities, characteristics that define one group from another. There's no master list of what makes an ethnic group. That could be religion, it could be language, it could be geography, it could be culture. There are any number of things that separate one ethnic group from another. There's no one way to stack those, no uniform way to distinguish one ethnic group from another, right? So an ethnic group will define itself, or other groups will say that is an ethnic group, but there isn't one common set that says, oh, well, if they have the same language, then it's not separate ethnic groups. That's clearly not true. Or that you can have different ethnic groups even though they're bound by a common language. So religion can be the same thing. And ethnic identity is important to understand within the terms of politics because it's not inherently political. So an ethnic group does not necessarily or inherently make a political claim. If I say that I'm Irish American or German American, or someone says that they're Turkish German, that isn't necessarily making any kind of claim about politics. It's simply making a claim about the particular kinds of ethnic identities that they are connected to, that they feel identified by, that they relate to. So those are cultural and social values. They can be the foundation for politics, but are not necessarily so. But then we get into a term that is much more inherently political, and that's the idea of a nation. So I come down to the tribe. I could certainly talk about Native Americans as being ethnic groups in the United States. Absolutely. Differences in history, differences in language, differences in culture, differences in myths, differences in origin, right? Everything that we might think about in terms of being central to ethnic identities, we could ascribe to Native American groups all across the United States. So an excellent example. But what's interesting to me is that the Puyallup Nation uses this term nation. So why does this police car say on it Puyallup Nation? There's a very specific reason for this. Because when we look at the political order of the United States, right, there are in fact three forms of political order. There is the central or national government, right? We talk about the state, we use this term government in the United States, but really we're talking about the state that resides in Washington, D.C., that has power over all of the territory. We have federalism in the United States, and so we have local authority, but there is also tribal sovereignty. So remember, this is an important element when we think about sovereignty, when we think about states, we think about that idea of having sovereign control over territory. And when we think about nations, we think about nations are what? They are political identities with claims to sovereignty. And so we'd say, if the Puyallup Nation says that they are a nation, is that politically accurate in the way in which we understand it in comparative politics? And the answer is absolutely yes. So the way in which the political structure is developed in the United States, the way the laws are constructed, the way in which federalism exists in the United States, there is specifically forms of sovereignty which are devolved to tribes at different levels and different degrees across the United States. So a central element of sovereignty, of that idea of national identity, right, is that claim to having rights over your own territory. And that devolved power absolutely exists with the Puyallup tribe and many tribes across the United States, where they have that political power, not just to wield their own police force, not just to have sovereign control over their own territory, to promulgate and maintain their own laws, in many cases that exist completely independent of the state in which they find themselves. It's a happy coincidence that where this police car is parked, and I'm in front of the Puyallup tribe's police station, if you look to the back behind me, you'll see an enormous casino that the tribe has recently constructed. It just opened in the past few months. They've been building sort of larger and more expansive casinos over the past few years as they have been successful in the gaming business. Now, there are rules inside the state of Washington for gambling, for gaming, right? But those laws do not apply to the Puyallup tribe. So the Puyallup tribe is able to build casinos. They're able to have particular kinds of regulations over taxation over things like cigarettes. They're able to sell fireworks, all of these things which, when you get a few blocks from here, literally if I walk to the end of the street, those laws no longer apply. So it is in a way almost like walking from one political unit, one state in that central sense, not in the way in which you use it in the United States, but from one sovereign unit to the other. So again, when we think about nations, remember, we can talk about nations perhaps without ethnic groups. We can certainly talk about ethnic identities without nations. But even here in the United States, we can find ourselves in a situation where we say there is not necessarily one American nation. And our political order, in fact, understands that there are a multiplicity of nations in the United States. The Puyallup tribe's claim for sovereignty, backed in the federal law of the United States, allows them to devolve power to organize their life in a particular way, right? So this is an excellent example of how we see the notion of nations as a political institution at work even inside the United States. So I hope that this goes some way in helping you understand the distinction between an ethnic identity and a national identity, and we'll continue to talk about more of these issues as we go forward. Okay, thanks, and I'll see you again soon.